Hi there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about Nigeria's foreign relations. As you know, not the major emphasis of this course, but we try to cover a couple of things for each country anyway. And I'm going to introduce this by defining a couple of concepts that you may or may not already be familiar with, but that's important to understand some of the aspects of Nigeria's role in the world that I'll be talking about today. Different sovereign states join international organizations, that is to say, clubs of sovereign states, for a variety of reasons, some economic, some political, some cultural, et cetera, et cetera. But comparative political scientists often characterize these international organizations in two different ways. The first type of international organization that we care about is supranational, supra meaning over. I think that's Latin, but I took French because my mom made me. A supranational organization has some degree of sovereignty over states. When you join a supranational organization, you are agreeing that you're going to surrender your sovereignty in some specified area to that organization. Doesn't mean you give up all decision-making power. Doesn't mean you say, "Oh, I'm just going to, stop being a state altogether." It's not merging into a different state. But a supranational organization does have some decision-making power over its member states. The other and different type of international organization is intergovernmental, between governments. In an intergovernmental organization, sovereign states collaborate with each other voluntarily. It's why they signed up to join in the first place. But they aren't necessarily bound by that organization's decisions. If they don't like something that it's done, they can leave or they can opt out. Let me give you just one example of each, and I'll talk you through a couple of the context of Nigeria in a moment. The United Nations, for the most part, is an intergovernmental organization. It includes basically almost every country in the world. It has a really wide-ranging remit, including trying to pursue world peace, promote cultural development, preserve historic monuments, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But ultimately, its decisions are not, for the most part, are not binding on member states. So the UN can pass kind of resolutions and declaratory statements through the UN General Assembly on basically any issue that it wants, but it has really, really limited powers to compel its members to do something. So it's there as a forum for member states to work out their problems with each other and to try and work together to find solutions to global problems. But it's not necessarily, it has really limited ability to actually tell member states what to do. Member states ultimately retain their sovereignty. By contrast, the European Union, which we'll talk about a lot when we get to the United Kingdom, is a supranational organization. When you join the European Union, you surrender some policymaking authority to the European Union in some defined areas. So, for instance, EU member states know that when they sign up to join the EU, they are going to join this common free trade area. So they're surrendering a good degree of their ability to make trade policy, to set their own tariffs. Similarly, they agree that they're signing up to a significant extent to a common immigration policy, that any EU member state has to let the citizens of any other EU member state live and work in its territory. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that those states lose all sovereignty, lose all decision-making power, right? So the EU, for instance, can't compel its member states to go to war or otherwise dictate their foreign policy decisions. That leads me to one last point that if you don't internalize right now, you're going to have a really frustrating time when we talk in class about these two types of organizations, which is that these definitions are not graven in stone. Lots of international organizations will have some characteristics of both types, right? So, for instance, the European Union absolutely is a supranational organization with respect to trade policy, but it's also going to do things like issue various declaratory statements that it has no power to enforce in areas where it really operates more as an intergovernmental organization. If you look for international organizations to fall really neatly into one or the other of these categories, or for that matter, if you try to Google to find a definitive list of which organizations are supranational and which are intergovernmental, you're going to have a bad time. Nobody handed these down graven in stone tablets. So just take all of these definitions with a grain of salt. That said, I will say that the College Board, which produces the closest thing to an engraved stone tablet that I care about in my teaching and planning, does specify that two organizations are supranational. And I don't know why they chose these two, but they've chosen them anyway. Those are ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which I'll talk about in a second, and the World Trade Organization. So just worth noting if you're prepping for the AP exam that for whatever reason, the good folks at the College Board have decided that those two are the defining examples of supranational organizations. Just know that, grown-up political scientists may disagree with some of those characterizations. Okay, we're going to think about Nigeria's foreign policy on two levels. First is in Africa, and then second is in the world at large. Um, Nigeria is a member of two African international organizations, which are important in understanding the ways in which Nigeria is trying to project its power. The first is ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which is a supranational organization. This is a group of states, as the name implies, in West Africa, whose original purpose was to promote trade within West Africa. That's the mission when it's founded in 1975. More recently, ECOWAS has also started to be a force in contributing to peacekeeping missions elsewhere on the continent and beyond Africa. And it's also started putting pressure on its member states to democratize and to respect the rule of law, partly for its own sake and partly because countries where the rule of law is widely protected tend to be better at attracting foreign investment. The headquarters of ECOWAS is in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. Nigeria contributes about 40% of the budget of ECOWAS, and it also is a major player, I think the biggest contributor to its peacekeeping missions in terms of sending troops to do those missions elsewhere in the world. One other organization, and this is an intergovernmental organization, is the African Union. This started out in 1963 as the Organization of African Unity. I think it's in 2002 that it turns into what is attempting to be a more all-encompassing organization called the African Union. The goal there is, again, to promote free trade and also political cooperation on a pan-African level. Most states in Africa are member nations. And the African Union as well has been increasingly involved in peacekeeping operations with a particular emphasis on trying to use African troops to carry out peacekeeping operations on the African continent. Nigeria has been a really major player in the African Union by virtue of its size and its economic and military power. It used the African Union as a platform to, for instance, criticize apartheid rule in South Africa and white rule in what was then called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. So it's used both of these organizations to try and project power, to try and establish its status as a major player in Africa and thus in the world. And Nigeria is actually now occasionally using its status as a leader in both of those organizations to argue that it should be the first African nation to get a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. In my uninformed estimation, that's unlikely to happen particularly soon, but keep an eye out. I could well be wrong. Moving beyond the African continent, Nigeria is also a member of a number of international organizations whose membership spans the globe. One of those is OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is a cartel that seeks to coordinate oil production. Not all oil-producing countries are in OPEC, but Nigeria is one of them. We'll talk about some non-OPEC member states in this course a little bit later on. And so through OPEC, Nigeria attempts to try and essentially coordinate the oil market, which is a really genteel term for rigging the oil market or suppressing production in an attempt to stabilize prices and ensure that its oil exports will be profitable. It's by no means the biggest or most producing member of OPEC, but it does have a seat at the table there. Additionally, Nigeria, like most other countries in the world, is a member of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. This is, again, a supranational organization. It has the College Board stamp of approval for you calling it that. The WTO is there to set trade policy and to mediate disputes between member nations. You can, if you're a WTO member, also join regional blocs like the African Union or ECOWAS or the European Union. But the WTO sets kind of a baseline for countries being willing to trade with each other. Basically says these are the most restrictive conditions that you can have with other WTO members. One other thing to note is that if we're thinking about the historical trajectory of Nigeria's democratization, if we're trying to explain why the military government actually gives up power and agrees to hold elections in 1999, one thing worth noting is that the international community put a lot of pressure on the government of Sani Abacha, especially after the pretty obviously illegal execution of the activist Ken Saro-Wiwa in 1994. After that, the United States and the European Union imposed economic sanctions on Nigeria, and this was one of the factors that helped convince leaders after Abacha's death that Nigeria really needed to democratize in order to be able to project power, in order to be able to be welcomed into the international community. And that's one of the factors that helps explain that transition to the Fourth Republic. Last thing I want to note, thinking about Nigerian foreign relations, is that Nigeria has been independent of the British politically since 1960, but that colonialism continues to have a legacy which affects Nigeria's present. One really obvious manifestation of continuing British influence is that English is the national language. It is the official language of government in Nigeria, and a lot of Nigerian media publish in English as well. That's a direct legacy of British colonialism. Second, as we said when we talked about Nigeria's political regime, the Nigerian legal system is based in part on common law, which is a legacy of British colonialism, right? This is the legal system that's been imposed by the British, and a somewhat visually jarring reminder of that is that many Nigerian judges and lawyers have retained the practice of wearing powdered wigs, even though I'm not actually sure that this is super widely practiced in the United Kingdom anymore. Number three, as is true with many other former colonies, the relationship between many newly independent countries and their former colonial powers. Britain is a fairly popular destination for people immigrating from Nigeria, so I should say emigrating from Nigeria, whether to live or to work or to study. There's an estimated 200,000 people who were born in Nigeria living in the United Kingdom today, although you'll find different quantifications of that number. And the UK is also a major destination for Nigerians who want to do university or graduate work abroad. Finally, Nigeria, it should be noted, is a member of an organization called the Commonwealth of Nations. This is very definitely not a supranational organization. It's mostly symbolic. It encompasses mostly former British colonies, plus a couple of others who joined for reasons that have never been clear to me. And it's got some, kind of founding commitments, or these kind of principled statements about democracy, about equality, about peace. They hold a mini Olympics every 4 years called the Commonwealth Games for their member states, and they do occasionally take symbolic gestures. For instance, Nigeria was actually suspended in 1995 from its membership in the Commonwealth after the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa. This is a largely symbolic organization, but it is just worth noting that sometimes the College Board folks really want you to demonstrate your understanding of the influence of imperial histories on Nigeria's present. And these are all things that you can point to if you are asked that question. That's it. I will stop there. Thanks very much.